Thank you very much.
Mhm.
So, for those of you that can't see me, you're lucky. I'm a middle-aged white male wearing squarish glasses with short hair and a fake Tony Stark beard. And in the image of me on the slide, I've also got some fake flames coming from my fingertips. I'm actually professionally the global head of accessibility and inclusion for Atos Group, which is a large digital transformation provider. We've got about 110,000 employees around the world, and we do everything from weird stuff like quantum computing to more mundane things, which I'll come on to in a minute. But personally, I have skin in the game here because I'm dyslexic, I have ADHD, and I'm predisposed to being social. So if you've done Myers-Briggs, I'm ENFP. If you have done the Facet 5, I'm evangelistic. So I'm here to convince and persuade. It's about hearts and minds. And so outside of work, I'm also co-founder of Access Chat, which is an online community, both on Twitter and YouTube and other social media channels where we meet and interview people, and have been doing so for the last 6, 7 years, and a non-exec for various charities, B corporations, and non-government organizations. So I, as I said, work for a very large technology firm, and we do literally everything from landing space probes on comets. So I've just realized I can't spell comet. That's the joy of dyslexia. And building quantum computers to delivering the IT for the Olympics and Paralympics. So this scene here is a bunch of people working on delivering the Paralympics and Olympics experience in Rio 2016, where we had a big team delivering all the results, real time, etc., doing all the cybersecurity and stuff. But more to the point, we deliver everybody's day-to-day IT experiences too. We support millions of users in their workplace. So that's a bit about me and the organization I work for. I'm globally responsible for accessibility, and that's lots of different plates being spun. So I want to tell you a story about this and use metaphor really, because metaphor is probably the way to really get across the complexity, but also how we might deal with accessibility and the complexity of it at such scale, within organizations and across countries, because we also work with public sector. So um, some of this story you'll have definitely heard before. You know, you're not new to accessibility. You found XCon, so therefore um, you're going to know the basics. But bear with me, because I want to try and give a wider context as to how we're approaching inclusion within the organization. So there's a picture of a lady reading a storybook. Pretty much all of my illustrations, unless I say otherwise, are pretty illustrative things. And when they become impertinent, I will describe them in greater detail. So when you hear the word sustainability, do you think about the environment, green energy, windmills, solar panels, etc.? I've got a picture of a field full of windmills here. What's the link between sustainability and accessible and inclusive technology? And it's a fair question. Why am I making a link between these two things? They seem to be unrelated. So, you know, people look at me a little strangely when I say we ought to be using these concepts and these frameworks. So there's a question mark in both my slides and amongst the people that I'm talking to often. Well, as we go on this story, hopefully I'll be able to explain that context a bit more. So, a child born in Japan in 2007 has a more than 50% chance of living past the age of 107. I couldn't actually find a birthday cake with 107 candles, so a picture of a chocolate cake with the candles for 100th birthday will have to do here. But I think you get the point, because actually children born in that year in most of the advanced economies in the world are going to have similar odds of living past their 100th birthday. And that has some pretty profound implications. There's a picture of an older chap here looking out towards the camera, and most disabilities are acquired as people age. So the average age at which someone acquires a disability, or rather most disabilities are acquired within the period of working age, and then we continue to accumulate them as we get older. And sometimes we don't consider them to be disabilities. So I've got glasses. My eyesight has definitely degraded. Without those glasses, I would now be struggling to read and do my work. And yet we still haven't reached the point where I consider myself to have a visual impairment. But it certainly impacts my life, and I'm certainly not planning on dying anytime soon. So I'm likely to acquire further age-related degradations of function, probably end up wearing a hearing aid like the chap in this picture here, or like both of my parents. So that is something that I've accepted as an individual, but I'm not going to be alone in that. At the same time, older people with disabilities are working. They're working for longer. This lady here serving up dried mango in a market in northern Thailand obviously enjoyed her working life. She was very happy. She's probably in the late 80s, full of beans, absolutely joyous. At the same time, not everybody wants to be working into their 80s. Not everybody has a job that's enjoyable, but some people have to do it because of the financial reasons. They need to support themselves, they need to support their families, whatever. At the same time, the modern lifestyles that we now have are contributing to an increased incidence of acquired disabilities and long-term health conditions. And I'm a sucker for a good burger. I put this picture in because everyone associates these loaded burgers with our poor diets, but I still enjoy them. But in all seriousness, poor diet, poor exercise, our sedentary nature, everybody's been sat at home in front of Zoom calls for 12 hours a day since the pandemic struck. These are going to have an impact on our health, long-term, musculoskeletal conditions, maybe heart conditions, diabetes. All of these things can then have an impact and increase the incidence of disabilities. At the same time, we're still consumers. And in fact, older people hold a lot of the wealth in society. I think it was John Kemp that said that actually a quarter of America's wealth was actually tied up in the equity owned by disabled people. And by that, he meant older people that had acquired disabilities. So there is this huge consumer segment. So the chap looking at the books here is representative. In my slide, sorry, the chap looking at the books in my slide is representative of the consumers around the world that have the disposable income and the equity. So that wealth is necessary for our economy. So we need to make sure that it's unlocked and that people are able to participate. So it's really imperative that we enable people to remain economically independent and active for as long as possible if we want our societies, our cultures to be prosperous, and coherent. The other big reason is that actually the demographics are skewed to such an extent that whereas cultures before were able to care for their elders, we now have an inverted demographic pyramid, which if there were 3 younger people for every 2 older people in 1960, there are actually going to be 2 elders for every younger person by 2060, which means that relying on the younger generation to care for the older generation is no longer viable. So technology has a role to play. New technological and economic models actually can empower inclusion in society. We're seeing the transformation that has happened in the last 12 months. A lot of the disabled community have been asking for it for a very long time and told it wasn't possible. But COVID has given light to that. So the picture of the lady at the keyboard in my slide is just one example of people being able to use tech. Tech gives people options to work in ways that suit them, whether that be working from home, working flexibly, using different tools. And some of those tools are just being developed now. So this next slide, I've got a picture of a 3D printer. And 3D printing has amazing prospects. So you can do all sorts of things to create personalized, accessible solutions for people and to distribute that assistive tech that you can make with 3D printing. So for example, for the chat that I talked about, I interviewed a guy in Colombia who is distributing blueprints for simple ergonomic solutions such as foot mice and ergonomic keyboards and razors and so on, that will raise up the keyboard to enable people to access their computers. And those blueprints are being shared with the local libraries, which are the places in the jungle where they have access to 3D printing. And so they're able to customize and make accessibility solutions for local people without having to buy them, without having to invest in supply chain, etc. So there are real potential. And of course, then there are things like prosthetic limbs that can be 3D printed, and also custom fitting of kit to individuals, much better than you could do through traditional methods. So 3D printing is offering all kinds of potential benefits for society. Now, I know some people might consider some of the smart speakers to be intrusive, but at the same time, smart devices have great potential to automate your home, embed them into the fabric and infrastructure of cities and your townscape. So at the moment, we may only have Google Home or Siri or Alexa, and we may be dabbling with the idea of home automation. The potential for this is really significant, and we've worked with a number of people where we've really automated an awful lot of stuff around their homes where they've relied on helpers previously, enabling people to be much more independent. And in fact, a friend of mine who is an inventor has created something called microblow technology, which actually translates breath into commands which can be sent to text to speech, which can then trigger home automation through Alexa, etc. So that someone that has pretty much no mobility and no speech can still use speech triggered or home automation. So there's real potential for enabling people to do stuff for themselves, to increase people's quality of lives through the use of this technology. So again, I see much potential, very optimistic about this kind of stuff. One of my team actually uses the Orcam device that the gentleman in the picture in my slide is wearing, and he uses that for all of the printed materials that he has to deal with in his day-to-day work. And augmented reality gives lots of opportunities to support people with low vision and cognitive and other disabilities. So I'm been really interested in this for a number of years. I'm also interested in the idea of not just overlaying information, but helping people absorb information and block out information, because some of the challenges around some of the neurodivergent conditions are the idea of overwhelm. So we've been doing research with a number of universities on neurodivergence and how we might use some of the augmented and mixed reality tools to help people. We've done some awareness raising stuff, but now we're actually thinking about how we could use augmented reality to almost reduce the stimulation, to block stuff out, help people focus, etc. So this is great. So here we have a picture of one of my favorite things. It's the Xbox Adaptive Controller. Kudos to Microsoft. Accessibility puts customers, employees, you, me in control. And sometimes that's for the first time ever. And I really love the adaptive controller, and I love the packaging even more, because the packaging is a really great example of inclusive design, because you've the team thought about it and you can open it with one finger. Okay, enough positivity. There has to be a but. We make hurdles as society for people to jump over before they can realize the potential of the technology and their own potential as individuals. Inaccessibility is effectively closing the door on talent. It's locked like the padlock in my picture. And we want people to be able to bust through, because I want to make sure that people have opportunity. Instead of that, right now, that lack of access leads to a huge disability employment gap. Only 47% of people in the UK who are of working age and report a long-term health condition or disability are in work, compared to 80% of the population who don't have a disability. That figure is pretty much repeated around the global north and rises anything up to 90% in the global south. That's just not acceptable. Poor accessibility directly impacts the prospects of hundreds of millions of people with disabilities. This is the disability employment gap. And here I've got a picture from the London Underground saying, mind the gap. And we really ought to be minding the gap. That underemployment is unnecessarily burdensome on the individual, the societies, and the economies that they live in. Right? The picture here shows a group of people all coming together, but lack of accessibility doesn't just affect one person. It has an impact on all of us. It impacts on societies even when we don't see it impacting on us. Businesses also lose out when they don't give access to all of their customers. And I cheekily put in a Domino's box here, because those of you in the know will know that Domino's have fought against accessibility in the past, which seems mad to me, because they're losing customers. They decided to fight with a customer that wanted to buy their product. On the other hand, I want to build a future where everyone can participate, and I want it to be beautiful. I've got a picture here of a spiral ramp, which is a nice architectural feature. It's sloped at the right kind of angle to allow people to easily wheel up it. It doesn't look like an afterthought. If we think about this figure, a 10% rise in the employment rate, amongst the disabled adults in the UK would contribute an extra £12 billion a year to our tax revenue by 2030. That's significant. And what this is doing is it's taking people from receivers of state benefit to contributors. So they're contributing to society, they're contributing to their own health and well-being, and they're contributing to our tax break, to our tax regime as well. So these things are all positive, right? At the same time, how is this linked to sustainability? Now, I've talked about a good story, the familiar one, if you like, around accessibility. But how's that related to sustainability? And where am I going with this story? Well, businesses already report on sustainability, and the reporting metrics are beginning to include social factors such as disability. Now, this is a complex slide. It's got 4 quadrants, and it's covering business and innovation, ethics and governance, environment and people. And this is actually how, over the last few years, my organization has reported on sustainability. And then inside those quadrants, we've got 3 circles. And in the outer circle, what you see is the links to the various different numbers of the UN sustainability goals for 2030. And inside there, then we're talking about the various different aspects of our business that relate to those goals. And that things like resilience, attractiveness, and eco-friendly offers, making sure that we reduce our carbon consumption. People-wise, we need to engage our people, make sure that we take care of them, that we have a well-being at work program, which includes disability. We have ethics and governance, so talking about the need for designing systems that aren't going to disadvantage people. Of course, we have to think about data protection, bribery and corruption. It's a holistic approach. We've been in this space for quite some time. Atos is actually #1 rated for sustainability out of any organization in our sector. We're CDP A rated, and we're particularly strong on decarbonization. So we've actually set targets which are super ambitious. We are going for net zero by 2028. So that's something I think that the organization is proud of. And then we're also reimagining what our approach and our governance is around sustainability. And that is an ESG approach, which is environmental, social, and governance. And particularly, accessibility sits within social, but the application of it is in governance. And this is where I want to start bringing some of those parallels. So what we have on the slide is a 2-way matrix showing the relevance for stakeholders and the impact on our organization. So, and then each of the little dots have either an E for environment, S for social, G for governance. And you can see things like employees' health and safety, eco-efficient digital technologies and solutions, our carbon footprint, our client satisfaction and capability of our people to deliver, our compliance with laws, including anti-bribery and accessibility. I mentioned the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and actually disability inclusion is embedded into quite a number of them. For example, Goal 4, equal and inclusive education. Goal 17, monitoring of SDGs with disability disaggregated data. Now that's quite a mouthful, but essentially this is actually saying we need to be more detailed in how we measure disability and not to lump it all together as one amorphous mass, because we need to understand people's needs. Goal 8, promoting inclusive economic growth. That means inclusive of people with disabilities, inclusive of people like me, inclusive of our audience, of our customers. Creating accessible cities and green public spaces. As an organization that is interested in and very much involved with the creation of smart cities, we want to make sure that they're accessible. And then emphasizing social and economic and political inclusion of persons with disabilities. So making sure that we don't exclude people in the voting process, making sure that we engage people with technologies and access to either vote in person, vote online. All of these things are super important for our inclusion in society. And those are considered sustainable, because society needs to be sustainable, not just the environment. So one of my heroes of the accessibility world, Jim Tobias, observed that inaccessibility is kind of like pollution. And this observation was at a conference about 5 or 6 years ago, and it really stuck with me. And I reached out to Jim, and we had a lot of conversations about this and the ecosystems and everything else. So you can pollute the world, but it does you no good. So I've got a guy here holding the flowers, a bunch of flowers, wearing a gas mask. That's not the kind of society we want to live in. Retrofitting accessibility to broken, inaccessible products is a bit like gas. So the logical extension of the idea that Jim had is to take the frameworks that we've designed to address pollution and apply them to accessibility. So looking at externalities. So smog would be a good example of an externality. It's pollution. It's created by the factories belching out smoke and going into the atmosphere and mixing with the moisture, and then creating something that everyone can see that is damaging to our lungs, that is clearly not good, but at the same time, the people that make it aren't paying for it. So here we have a picture of factories belching out smoke. When we don't include the environmental costs of the manufacturer in the price that people pay for goods, then it's society that's paying the bill. And that is the economic concept of externalities. Poor accessibility is also an externality. It's an externality of the production and planning process. If it's in the physical world, like this lady here in her mobility scooter, she's having to squeeze herself underneath a pedestrian gate that has not been designed with disability in mind. It's a kind of pollution, and it's unnecessary. We can do better. What's more, the polluter isn't paying for this. Society's paying for this, and we're paying a high price to deal with the negative externality of inaccessibility. So here we have a picture of someone counting money, and it's all about the green. The impact of disability discrimination cases are really high, and we've seen them. They're all over the internet. We in the accessibility industry talk about them all the time. We wave the big threatening accessibility discrimination, disability discrimination case stick at people. But the actual risk of going to court statistically is still relatively low, especially if you're a really large company or a large organization with a fleet of lawyers behind you. the smaller companies that are more at threat here. When legislation is not enforced, businesses are often willing to gamble. So I have a picture here of people playing poker. I have lost count of the amount of times where I've been working on projects with organizations where they go, yes, we understand that there's a risk around this. Let's put it on the risk register, because they've taken a calculated risk that their project won't be picked up, that their organization won't be the one that will get sued, or that they can afford to deal with that later. So legislating isn't really enough. We need frameworks, applicable frameworks, just like we applied to light bulbs. Now, I had a light bulb moment here, and actually there's a picture of a light bulb in my slide, and another one in this one. But this time it's an incandescent light bulb, because the story of light bulbs is really important, because it gives us a precedent. Incandescent light bulbs were cheap to buy, but their inefficiency created a very negative externality of pollution. At the same time, efficient LED lights used to be very expensive, hence the picture in my slide of money flowing out of a pot. Now, LEDs are cheap to buy and run, and that has come about through a combination of legislation, regulation, and a timeline for implementation that allowed industry to adjust. And we need to work with industry. In order for any framework to be successful, there needs to be a balance struck. We need both carrots and sticks. And I've got a picture here of a person walking a slack line, and essentially creating a framework that is applicable and is going to be accepted by all parties is a bit like walking a tightrope or a slack rope, because you need to find that balance. Sticks only work if they're used consistently. We need to create the certainty for business that it's going to cost them to be inaccessible. They need to understand that if they take an action and their product isn't accessible, there is a cost to that. So I have a picture of a stick here. At the same time, any penalties or levies must differentiate between new and existing products. So, and this is the way that it worked with light bulbs. There was a timeline and a framework for doing this. So the penalties that business paid in the beginning for not having the right specifications and not delivering LEDs were quite small, but they ramped up rapidly. And that's why I have a picture of seedlings growing here, because essentially what we want to do is set business on a path where they know that they can grow, and that we don't punish them for the sins of the past. Because we all know, having worked in the technology industry, that retrofitting accessibility is really hard. What we want to do is encourage people to make new and better products. What we need are the carrots. I've got a picture of a bunch of them here. We need to offer businesses incentives to be accessible. We need to make it attractive. But we already have an economic framework for carbon emissions trading. So why reinvent the wheel? Let's take the opportunity to adopt a similar concept around inclusion. So I've got a picture here of a large port, and essentially, you know, businesses often trade around carbon. Some are better than others, and in fact, we as an organization now acquired a business recently called EcoAct, which helps our partners and our customers offset their carbon emissions. In fact, within our own organization, we apply an internal carbon tax to our activities. So we already understand that our energy consumption and carbon has a negative effect on the environment, and that we need to do something about that. And in order to do something about it, we need money. So what we've done is we've built the cost of dealing with the negative externalities of carbon emissions into our pricing and our delivery of products. We can use this approach for accessibility. Everyone says, oh, accessibility is too hard. Oh, it's too expensive. Not if we plan for it. So there's a picture here of some crumpled up notes, but essentially we can do this. We can build the costs and plan so that it becomes part of our business as usual. Money that we collect in fines and internal taxes can be subsidizing our investments in accessibility, not just in web accessibility, but looking at how we design products to be inclusive, thinking about how we ensure that we enable people through brain-computer interfaces. These things are expensive. So, you know what? Having an internal tax on this kind of stuff enables us to invest in R&D. I've got a picture of a robot here. We do like to anthropomorphize stuff, but actually I found that some of the most successful robots don't look anything like humans. Inclusion can also follow the approach that we've taken towards decarbonisation by measuring the impact of our supply chains and our business ecosystems. So when we are addressing carbon emissions in our own business and others, the standard approach is to look at scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. We can do this for accessibility. So scope 1 would be the direct impact from owned or controlled resources, products and services, the stuff that we make, the stuff that we deliver to our customers. We can make that accessible. Scope 2 would be the indirect impact that we're having on the community from stuff that we purchase and services that we purchase. So we can choose to buy more accessible products. And then we can look at the indirect impacts in scope 3 of stuff that happens in our value chain, including both upstream and downstream. So both ways in our supply chain, the impact that we have on the people supplying us and their suppliers, and also our customers. And through doing this, through procurement and structure and so on, we can start working not just within our own organization, but creating an ecosystem of businesses that work together. So I've got a little sort of breakout diagram with a measure, because that's really what we do in order to look at carbon emissions, and we need to measure accessibility in lots of ways too. So, as I said, a sustainable approach to accessibility is a positive one for business. It opens up new markets. It supports economic growth. You know, we have a picture of a seedling growing out of a 50-euro note. I've used dollars before, but as an employee of a European company, I thought I would go for the euro this time. Takes time to do this though. So cleaning up the pollution cycle of inaccessibility will take a coordinated effort, and it's going to require a new way of doing things and working together, etc. So I've got a picture of some guys actually in the city of Mecca running and sweeping up. We need to coordinate. Just like with environmental protection, prevention is better than cure, and that's why we need to intentionally design to do the right thing and continuously monitor. And there'll be other talks by other great people throughout this conference talking about design, talking about how you monitor and how you measure. So I'd just like to leave you with a final thought, and that really is, I've told you a story, and that story's, I hope, giving you an idea about how you might reframe delivering accessibility within your own organization and across other organizations that you work with. But also, let's reframe accessibility, because sometimes people complain about the word accessible. They say it's boring, it's too technical. Well, why not swap the word accessible with awesome? Because who doesn't want to make something awesome? Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Neil, for a wonderful presentation. So we have some comments in chat here I'd like to share, and then we've got some questions over in the Q&A as well. So I'll share some of the comments I see in chat here. Mike says he loves the idea of finding ways to build this into the process of funding accessibility as part of the business as usual process. Certainly the open source frameworks that runs much of the internet could benefit from this type of support.
Excellent.
Yeah, definitely, Mike. So from, let's see. Oh yeah, Mike also says, nice to hear about the 3D printing library. Could benefit so many people around the world. Loves the open hardware movement and opportunities to learn from others.
Yeah, I think that actually that we can learn an awful lot from the global south. I work with a number of overseas development corporations where they're working in Africa and Latin America. And there's a tremendous amount of innovation going on in those spaces because they don't have the established health infrastructure or ways of paying for this stuff that we have in the global north. So it's really, if you want to see where innovation's happening, look to the global south, look to Africa, look to India. There's amazing stuff going on there.
Yeah, there definitely is. Let's see here. All right, I'm going to go ahead and go over to a couple of the questions here. So Ricardo says, hi, Neil from Argentina. He would like to know, how would you introduce accessibility in the global south, where revenues and corporations are short and inclusion is not seen as an investment or human right, but more of an expenditure?
Well, I think that that's where economic models like this come into play, because you're illustrating that it costs the state less to provide services and engage people in the economy than to try and support them without them being engaged and economically active. So this is a way of building employment, building capability, reducing taxpayer spend, and doing it in a measured way. So these are not short-term things that we're talking about here, and I fully appreciate that. When I went to Argentina, they are undertaking some good initiatives on accessibility, but it takes time, and the economy. There are always other pressures within the economy, but it's actually about making it part of that economic framework rather than a separate thing that starts to sort of embed it and include it in how we do things. And that's why the applicability of frameworks is important. Environmentalism wasn't something that was considered important. It was considered a cost before. And what we've done is by having these frameworks, we've made it cheaper. It's now cheaper to have efficient LEDs than inefficient incandescents. So it's those sort of changes in the frameworks and how we do this stuff that enable business and encourages, so you're putting pressure on them to do things, but you're also giving them time to do it. So with notice and encouragement and a business opportunity, they will take it even if there isn't huge money, because actually they can make more money, be more profitable, and less wasteful by taking these approaches. But yeah, it's not an immediate pivot.
Mm-hmm. And you had talked about, you had said prevention is better than a cure. And
Yes.
I would imagine prevention is a lot less costly than a cure as well.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why we're talking about new products being the main thing.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, we've seen in legislation in Europe, for example, where they introduced the requirements for accessibility for new products before the requirements for the retrofitting of accessibility for older ones, because they understand that that's a much greater challenge,
Mm-hmm.
and the hope is that when you're making new things accessible, you also learn, and then you've got the economies of scale to be able to transition away from the old products better.
Right.
Yeah.
That makes total sense. Um, let's see here. We have time probably for one more question, maybe two. So Misty says, this is an interesting parallel, sustainability and accessibility. Do you have any resources you would suggest if I want to explore this parallel further?
There aren't huge amounts of resources yet. This is something that I'm absolutely passionate about. I think that there are a few of us working on these topics to start really building building accessibility better into sustainability reporting. So there is reporting in GRI and DJSI. These are excuse me, these are global reporting indices for sustainability, but they're more about storytelling and individual things that you've done. And what I'm hoping that we can get to over time is building clear metrics and KPIs. So part of the work that I'm doing within our own governance program is working on this, and I know other organizations are doing the same thing, so that we can get benchmarks, so that we can measure this stuff, so that it doesn't just become, oh, well, we ran this project where we gave away a bunch of hearing aids in Africa or India, or we did this thing once. Or what this has got to be is replicable, it's got to be scalable, and we've got to be able to measure this stuff, because everything else that we report on should be measured. And I think the other piece is, when I talked about us doing sustainability, we actually do report on our sustainability. We do what we call a combined report. So when we do our annual report, it's not just our financial results. So we have all of these things which are called extra financial measures, including accessibility, including the work that we do in society. So if investors see that we're not doing a good job on this materially affects our share price. And that also then has an impact on decisions made within our organization. So again, as organizations start to embed this kind of reporting in their way of doing things, and this is it's going to become more and more common, because if you look at all the big investment companies, they're asking for it, then that's our opportunity to start doing this in a much more measured and systematic way.
Yep. And measuring it helps create that motivation, right?
Yeah,
to continue to improve.
Absolutely. I think there's an organization called Tortoise Media that created the first sort of indices which included disability. So you might be able to go out and find that. If I can find it afterwards, I'll post it.
All right. Sounds good, Neil. So we're just on time at the end of the session. So I'll go ahead and wrap us up here. Thank you for all the great comments in the chat. We got a lot of really good feedback there, Neil. People really enjoyed this presentation and learned a lot here. So thank you everyone for joining, and especially thank you, Neil, for the excellent content and your presentation. Just want to remind you all that the recording will be available on the session page after AXCON. Slides are available for download as well. So thank you again so much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of AXCON. Bye, all.